How's it going, everybody? My name's Dave Whipple and you're watching Bush Radical. Welcome back to part 2 of my series Radical Bushcraft. But don't let the name fool you, there's nothing radical about what I'm going to show you in these videos. As a matter of fact, it's my intention that this be the simplest, clearest version of what we would call bushcraft that you're going to find on YouTube. Today I want to talk about where just the idea of bushcraft came from. Not the skill set, but actually looking at it like a separate subject from the rest of life. I want to talk about the books that have really kind of solidified the idea of bushcraft. And at the end of this video, I'm going to show you the one perfect book. One book that's completely correct. One book that's utterly reliable. And I'm going to share that with you here after just a little bit. So let's get right into it. Where did bushcraft as a subject come from? Well, I think it's probably from around the time of the Industrial Revolution, in my opinion anyway, where instead of people being generalists and homesteaders and farmers, there started to be people that did one thing. They would work in a shop or in a factory, and they just would be from home to the factory, and they purchase the things they need as opposed to making them. If you were a pioneer, if you were in timber or logging or anything like that, if you farmed, you probably did a lot of this stuff yourself. Things we would consider bushcraft today, a lot of it was living skills 200 years ago. And around that time that split happened, and you start seeing people writing about the outdoors, I think people really started seeing the shrinking wilderness and the dividing of the wilderness with towns and logging camps. And you started to have that era where people, for the first time, would vacation to the wilderness and go camping as a vacation from work in town or in the city. And it really became a separate thing. Camping used to be what people did when they traveled from one place to another place slowly, by a horse or on foot. And it became something that people started to look back on and say, I want to go camping on my vacation from work. This is even back in the 1800s. I think Nesmik is probably the first person that really started to solidify that field of interest that we think of as quote-unquote bushcraft, because he was writing for an audience that was nostalgic for wilderness that they weren't in as much anymore, that they would only visit at certain times of the year. And in my opinion, Nesmik inspired Kephart and Baird and Bernard Mason and Bradford Angers and a lot of these people that wrote books. Let's talk about books. Whether you love deer hunting, or you love bass fishing, or you love camping, or you love canoeing, whatever, anything that's related to the outdoors is interesting to you, probably. And a lot of these survival bushcraft books are very tempting. Pick them up, good read, all kinds of information in there, lots of good knowledge, etc. Let's take a look at some of the books that are probably on somebody's shelf. Most of these books have been borrowed. One of them is mine. This one's mine. Woodcraft and Camping by Nesmik. I like Nesmik's whole outlook because Nesmik was an adventurous guy. He traveled, he did a lot of stuff solo. He spent a lot of time in the woods. You have to bear in mind that everybody that wrote a book is first and foremost an author, or you'd never have heard of them. Aside from being an author, he did a lot of backcountry travel. There's a credibility to him. One thing you have to be wary of is anybody who's ever had a book published is granted a certain amount of credibility because they're a published author. When you start looking at people and where they're from and how they got to that point and start digging into people's stories, it's good to have that context when you're reading what they're telling you. Let's take, for instance, here's Survival with Style, Bradford Angers. Bradford Angers wrote like 35 books about wilderness and survival and homesteading. And he's a guy who grew up on Henry David Thoreau, lived in Boston. Him and his wife ended up in Hudson Hope, which I've been through Hudson Hope half a dozen times. It's in northern British Columbia between Chetwynd and Fort St. John. And it is the middle of nowhere. So, the guy's got some interesting insight. He also talks about desert survival, which as far as I know, the guy never saw a desert. I may be wrong about that, but you have to take that into consideration. Now when you take a look at stuff like this in a book, this shows you how to make a wigwam. And I'll paraphrase this. You can cover a wigwam with a plastic sheeting, parachute silk, animal skins. That makes so many assumptions about the tools you have, your ability to locate animals of a good enough size to get their skin. There's a whole lot of hypothetical in here. How much of that information does he know is correct? Or does he know that the person he got the information from didn't just get it from somebody else, from another book, who got it from another book? What can you trust? What's real? Another borrowed book, Camping and Woodlore Craft. Dan Baird was an artist. He was an illustrator. He was an author. He belonged to a bunch of different organizations, and he started the Boy Scouts. So books like this, you know, are absolutely full of illustrations of stuff you could do. Who knows how many things the author actually did? How many things were just the author sat down to write a book and put everything in the book he could consider to put in there, when a lot of that stuff might have been from another book that was basically copied from another book, etc., etc. Now you take a look at a book like this, Bushcraft by Ray Mears. You know, all this is super high color, glossy pages. There's pictures of remote tribes from all over the world doing interesting bushcraft stuff. I'm sure there's lots and lots of good information in there. This is kind of the Rolls Royce of survival bushcraft books. Even the review quote on the back is by Ewan McGregor. Dan Baird was an author and an illustrator and an artist and an organizer. Horace Kephart was, I believe he was the librarian at Yale for a while. Morris Kohansky was in the Navy studying to be a chemical engineer. All of these people that are associated with the world of what we would think of as bushcraft probably have a little bit surprising backgrounds. And it's good to take a look into everybody's backstory to place in context the things that they pass on in their book. What book can you actually fall back on and know that the information in it is correct? That the author isn't just a salesman selling products and selling classes. The author's not just an author who makes their living writing and writes 35 different versions of the same thing. What book can you actually fall back on and know that all the information is correct? This one. This is the book that you can fall back on. This is the book of your own personal experience. Let that soak in for just a second. Bushcraft and survival as subjects are absolutely poisoned to the gills with the hypothetical. So many things people talk about are hypothetical. If you're in this situation, you can use these things to do this. It's hypothetical. How many times have we been beaten over the head with the term survival situation? Imagine you're in this survival situation, and this is the scenario, and these are the tools you have, etc., etc., etc. We're chest deep in hypothetical scenarios, hypothetical situations, hypothetical skill sets. The only book that you can trust is the book of your own personal experience. If you haven't done something with your own hands and seen it work, it's hypothetical. If you haven't physically taken it from an idea to actuality, it's hypothetical. It's not real yet. Let me tell you a story to illustrate that point. For years and years and years, I worked in a vacuum trying to learn how to do a bow drill fire. Nobody was around to show me. I didn't know anybody that knew how to do it. I just had a bunch of books. You know, I remember being in the Aleutian Islands 20 years ago and working with a bow drill, trying to get a bow drill fire to work. And this kind of was an on and off hobby for years and years and years. Finally, one time I saw something on television, I believe, a missing part that I wasn't aware of. And I'm like, oh, I get it. I went out to the yard. I was living in Delta Junction, Alaska at the time. I went out into the yard in January. It was probably 20 below zero. I went and found the materials I needed, and I lit a bow drill fire for the very first time in the driveway. And I was ecstatic because it's something I'd been goofing around with for a decade and never really serious, but also never getting anywhere. I remember I called my friend Matt on the phone. I said, Matt, I lit a bow drill fire. I got a piece of information that I wasn't aware of, and I figured it out. I can do it now. And I was telling Matt about the key pieces of information that I had just discovered, and he's like, yeah, I know. And I'm like, really? You've done a bow drill? He's like, no, but I know how to do it. And there's that big divide between knowing something and actually knowing something. If Matt would have needed to light a fire with a bow drill, he would have been where I started with only illustrations in a book to go by and the rough idea, without knowing the fine points, without knowing the patience that skill takes, without knowing the little, all the intricacies and idiosyncrasies of making that happen, lighting a fire with friction. Matt took it for granted that he knew how to do that skill when he'd never done it. And that is the biggest issue with bushcraft and survival that there is. As a subject, it's drowning in the hypothetical. Books, in my opinion, are chock full of stuff the author a lot of times has never done themselves. And the author is explaining to you how to do those things. And if you don't go out and proof that skill, make sure it works, make sure you understand it, then it's just hypothetical. It's just something you think you know, but you don't actually own that skill. Metaphorically, the book you can trust is the book of your own experience. Once you've done something, once you understand it, once you have done it with your hands, physically, then you can say, okay, that's real. Whether it's primitive traps, whether it's primitive fishing, whether it's primitive hunting gear, whether it's friction fire, whatever it is, building a shelter, purifying water. It doesn't do any good to know these things unless you've at least done them at least once and saw that it does work and saw that it works in your environment with the skills you have, with the tools you have. Doesn't matter what it is, just to know that it's real. So in closing, every book out there on survival and bushcraft has good information. I will also say every book out there has secondhand information. Information the author is just passing on. They've taken it from another source and presented it in just a slightly different version. The only book out there that is trustworthy, 100% accurate, is the book of your own personal experience. The stuff you know you can do because you've done it. That's always accurate. It's always true. It's the only thing you can count on. Thank you for watching Bush Radical. My name's Dave Whipple. Be radical, eh? See you soon.